Jesus is King. Laudetur Jesus Christus. Welcome to the Meaning of Catholic. I'm Timothy Flanders, and I'm joined today by Dr. Sebastian Morello and Dr. Matthew Miner. Gentlemen, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Timothy.
This is a series called the St. Joseph Dialogos, which is where we bring together opposing viewpoints under the patronage of St. Joseph. And we're talking today about the magic controversy, which is something that we actually had Dr. Morello on our other podcast earlier in the year before this was any controversy. But this is the subject of the discussion. Dr. Morello's book, Mysticism, Magic, and Monasteries. And this is published by our friend Dr. Peter Kwasniewski over at Ostiusti Press. And these were originally published, I believe all of them in the European Conservative originally. And so Dr. Morello's thesis, which we'll discuss, has been criticized by Dr. Meinard et al., my friend Thomas Muris and Matthew Scarins in this 33-page document. So I just want to encourage all the viewers and listeners, before you make comments, I encourage you to read the book and read the critique and get into the depths of what's going to be discussed here. But to start it off, I wanted to just read here from our other friend, Charles Coulombe, in his preface, which seems to kind of summarize the basic thesis here of Dr. Morello. So this is on page XII 12. He says this, quote, Coulombe, Morello strives to avoid the twin traps of overvaluing or entirely ignoring either the spiritual or the physical realms, seeing them as correlated principles of a whole. In this view, there is no element of life that is irrelevant to the Church and her mission. From cuisine to folklore to civil governance, all of life is linked to the Church one way or another. Against this all-encompassing view is the practical reduction of the redemptive reality of Christianity, especially Catholic Christianity, to a catalog of intellectual propositions. And this is thinking that Coulombe states has been with us for a long time. He says this disdainful point of view was very common in the years preceding the Second Vatican Council, when even the most conservative of writers would espouse similar sentiments. Morello contends that this mindset largely led to the post-conciliar debacle. End quote. So, Dr. Morello, would you like to just start us off with responding or summarizing or elaborating on any of those points, and then we could just have a free conversation?
Sure. I'd just like to say from the outset that it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you, Timothy, for making this possible. Obviously, this discussion has arisen from a sort of, I suppose, a month or 6 weeks or so of sort of attacks or criticisms of the book in question, and those criticisms were, to my mind at least, rather superficial, and often, it seemed to me at least, not issued in good faith. Because there were criticisms like, for example, that I'm encouraging the study of the dark occult or sorcery or something like that, and the book repeatedly distinguishes very sharply between what I'm talking about, coming from a Neoplatonist background, which is my background, from something like the dark occult or sorcery or witchcraft or anything like that, and these attacks repeatedly accused me of the one thing I identify that I am standing in very, very violent opposition to. So that was tedious for me, and then this 33-page document came out that Matthew co-authored, and I read it, and by the time I came to the end of it, I was really grateful, because I thought, well, finally something's been said here that is a sequence of important, robust, well-considered challenges that require engagement from me, and so I was very grateful. And I thought the more the more interesting and the more challenging responses to my book in that document, well, it was quite obvious that Matthew's fingerprints were all over those. So it's a great pleasure to have this conversation with him. And again, I thank you for chairing it, Timothy. Regarding what Coulomb says there, look, my concern for quite some time now has been that the church is contending with an inordinate propositionalism, a a a preference for overly abstract thinking, to the neglect of its mystical, liturgical tradition. And of late, not only has it placed, it seems to me, its liturgy at the service of just ongoing catechetical enterprises, but its more mystical dimension in its liturgical practice, which I have found, at least in the ancient apostolic Roman rite, the highest echelons of the church is now going around the world trying to take a sledgehammer to that, even though it seems to be sustaining so many people in the faith and in a very orthodox commitment to the ancient faith, which seems like an exercise in absolute ecclesiastical madness to me. So the question for me for some time now has been, well, uh, you know, how do we recover the mystagogical dimension of the church so as to initiate people and induct people through the stages of the as the early church put it, the arcana of the sacred mysteries. And I've been drawing from quite eclectic sources in order to try and think deeply about that question, which I do think is a pressing question. And having worked in an archdiocese for nearly 7 years as a leading trainer of catechists, one of the things that I noticed was that people tended to see the crisis in faith induction and faith retention in the church as just one of insufficient doctrinal catechesis, whereas it became more and more obvious to me, at least, that the crisis was actually one of an eclipsing of mystagogical catechesis. So now, just even though I do say this repeatedly in the book, let me just reiterate it so that there's no confusion about this. This is not an attack on the propositions of the faith. This is not to say that there are not articles of the faith and that they do need to be assented to in order to have the faith and to receive the faith. This is simply, I mean, look, I agree with what Thomas Aquinas says in the Summa Theologica, or Summa Theologiae, that in essence, the articles of the faith are not actually compelling to the intellect. The intellect must be moved by the will, and prior to that, there must be a sympathy between the human will or the created will and the divine will, and therefore, prior to any assent to the articles of faith, is an ongoing mystical experience, at least through prevenient grace. There's something very mystical going on deep in the soul of the potential disciple of the Lord. And what that means, of course, is that prior to propositional assent is mysticism, and the finality of propositional assent is mysticism, because we believe in the testimony of God so that he can unite us to himself in charity. And so from the perspective of efficient cause and final cause, we're always dealing with mystical experience. And yet, as a friend of mine said, who is a kind of expert on Russian sophiology, focusing on Solovyov, almost nowhere in the Western Church is the end for which the Christian life preached. Now, if that's true, even if it's a slight exaggeration, it's nonetheless a damning indictment. So this is, even if people don't necessarily agree with the way I've approached this issue or the way I can convey my own concerns, I hope that most people can at least be awake to the issue at hand, that there is a problem here and it needs to be addressed. And I think that's what Charles is alluding to. I hope that wasn't an inordinately long answer.
It
No, that's
wasn't
fine.
for
Go,
me,
go
but I'll
right ahead.
leave. Yeah, Timothy, how much are you going to be between
I'm
us?
not gonna jump in unless you need me to, so y'all just talk.
Okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, because that makes it better, to get in the headspace that we're just talking to each other. It makes it even. Sebastian, I mean, first of all, just, we're doing sort of the public, recognitions. I mean, it's of course great to do the public thing together. Of course, I appreciate the fact that even whenever all of this broke out late this summer, that we had time, online together to be able to, at least hash out a little bit of, where we stood and get to know each other. So you've shown yourself to be, I mean, really a good interlocutor, and I'm just glad to do this today. So there's a certain sense, as I even said, privately, that, effectively all the high points of what you said are things that I think I agree with. I do agree with. I shouldn't say I think I agree with. I know I agree with it. And I would even admit that perhaps I see things differently, maybe if it's nothing else than a different experience. So you spent 7 years doing catechesis and basically seeing the way that it doesn't shape an entire Catholic life. To be honest, you're right. The I think you've said this, whether it was in your book or elsewhere publicly. And if I think it's your spirit, if you didn't say it in words, and it's correct. I mean, I'm not critiquing it. Is that the it was one catechetical program after another is sort of what's proposed. It's a normal thing for a bishops' conference or at least a local diocesan hierarchy, even if they're ostensibly we could say on the propositional paper orthodox, which is it's a cramped view of orthodoxy, right? 'Cause then it's only in terms of doctrine and not in right glorification of God. But they strenuously find the newest program that's going to basically enable getting things off the book page into the unvarnished intellect of faith, of a faith assent that's basically stripped of the important, like the essential aspect of will that So like you were, I mean, face to face with that in a way that I never was, right? So there's a part of me that probably even when this whole controversy first broke out, that I thought I probably even said this to you because it's sort of from the worst part of my soul. I'll sometimes say to converts, like you didn't suffer through this as long as I have. I've been doing this for 40 years, and never would I have called the 40 years of my being Catholic a time of over propositionalism because it was all feels whenever I was a kid. Um, that's how to put it. It's the time. It's like watching. There is a reason that the traditionalists see a certain echo of modernism in everything that has been the ecclesiastical culture, and it was the modernist crisis that created a kind of um, overemphasis on conceptualization and the propositional structure of the truths of the creed, the truths of the faith, the kind of treatment of the deposit of faith like it's this free floating thing that's just
Yeah.
it's in the newest sphere that has to be beamed down, or we grab it, right? We just grab it and that's what the faith is. So I mean I do really admit that, as an issue. And I've done a lot of work with the people who were involved in the modernist crisis, and perhaps, and I've been accused of this by scholars, that I sometimes read charitably into people who are dear to me. I sort of fix the edges. I joke publicly. I say, well, Thomas Aquinas did that, right? He would take a source, and if something was a little off, right? So to give an example of it, like what you said about mysticism and the faith, I mean, that's effectively how I've always taught the so-called universal call to holiness. Because I always, to my students, I've always said, and I perhaps am not viscerally enough appreciating the fact that I'm shouting against the wind, even though I know that I am. I tell them when you preach, don't turn this into moralism,
Yeah.
right? And they're not going to, most people aren't going to do the dogmatic thing because they're going to feel undertrained to do it, right? So a kind of teaching of dogma is pretty rare, I think, in a certain kind of mediocre homily. But a reduction of Christianity to moralism is always the case.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of parallel to a certain concern. It's kind of moving over to moral propositions. And truth be told, that was the currency of a lot of even the papacy of John Paul II was a certain reduction of Christianity to sort of the life issues and things of that
Hmm.
sort in the kind of mainstream of the church. And that's not meant, I'm just making an observation. For those who are walking in and want to immediately think that these are just trads who are complaining, I mean, I'm just observing kind of trends that used to frustrate me as a kid, right? I actually, like as a 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old who was, I mean, just groping at the faith, I had a sense that I was only getting part of the story, right? So I always emphasize that in the end, to understand the teleology of faith, as you put it. The teleology of faith moves basically through all the rest of the theological virtues into, the mystical ways. Because ultimately the fact that faith is in a certain sense coterminous with the unitive and fruitive vision of God. It's going to have an inner impulse through the mystical life, and you basically cut the wings of all the faithful. Now, you know well enough, and I would presume a lot of the viewers do, that there are all kinds of resonances in the technical underbelly of me saying that come straight out of scholastics. Like, this is part of my schizophrenia as a Byzantine. Is that I sort of take a kind of primacy of the mystical from my scholastic forebears, Garrigou Lagrange, Argentero, Garté, others like that. But I think there's like the point that sort of there's sort of 2 points that had bothered me. So on the one point, I share in a certain critique of modernity, but I get really nervous about narratives of that sort. So as you remember in the article, it's sort of the fish doesn't rot at the head of Occam, it just rots at the head of the how to say peripatetics. Maybe that was a Freudian slip at the mendicants, right? So we just push back sort of the beginning. And truth be told, I mean, there's a certain narrative we can tell because of what happens in the university, that there's a cogency that
Yes.
downstream from the university system. I mean, and I've done that. I've since our encounter, I've done that to my
Yeah.
students. I've sort of given them a sort of intellectual genealogy to note the kind of crisis that in a certain sense we're still all living through, which is the introduction of a kind of primacy of scientific theology. And so, as you know, I shared with you some things I've been writing before our interchange. All of a sudden, I mean, I've sort of more radically embraced my own critique of that, right? Because of the positive side of what I think I've taken from the interaction with you thus far, which I hope, is an interaction that continues into the future of our existence, here below. Um, and of course, too, there's the question, though, and then I'll be quiet. There's the question of sources of mystagogy, and that's, I think, where we differ. Or not totally, right? You're a man of liturgy, monasteries. I think that in many ways, the kind of idea of a um, monastic imagination is kind of central to my mind. I even, for the ECT, for the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology, we had a panel on the state of theology. I mean, I even while I sort of said, well, you all know that I'm dealing with these questions of Hermeticism nowadays. Within 5 or 7 minutes of my intervention, I mean, I'm basically making the point that something perverse happens when the academy takes the monastery out of the center of the
Yeah.
theological life. And I could hear you as I'm doing it. I'm thinking, this is behind a paywall at first, but it's like if Morello hears this and gets to this point, he'll hear that like there's deep sympathy to me, and maybe it's just you can tell me in the course of our talk, I'm just so conservative. I would say, especially as a Byzantine, it's just like let the liturgy and the liturgical hymnody and the imagery of our canons and our akathist, etc. Let that do the work of the mystagogy. Um, and maybe I've inherited from even my dissertation director Tim Noon a fear that whenever you leave too much pure Proclean thought at the edges of your Christianity, all hell breaks out, if I might say it. And I'm thinking because he made a claim once that historically in the arts faculty in Paris, I don't know if I brought this up to you or not privately, he made this claim, and he's not the person to make it up. Tim Noon was a great historian. That around the time of the condemnations that start happening at the end of Thomas's life, that part of the things that like spook Bonaventure, for instance, is the fact that you actually have a kind of Proclean Hermeticism that's going on in the arts faculty.
Yeah.
Right. And that would make sense, even like the sources, because the Liber de Causis and other things, they're reading their Aristotelianism still at that time in a way that sees what I think is the correct way to be an Aristotelian in its overall Neoplatonic context. Because even
Sure.
there, we're different, but the same on the Neoplatonic question in many ways as well.
Yes.
So that's my way of both addressing you and then out of the side of my eye, knowing there are other people who are walking into this who don't quite know. So it's like
Sure.
I'm aware that I'm neither pleasing them nor totally pleasing a normal conversation between us. But those are my kind of thoughts just to kind of get us going. Yeah.
No, that's very helpful. There's a lot there. I feel a bit like a rabbit in headlights after that. So let me try to tread slowly and carefully for a moment. Um, One, just on the issue of the historiography of what I see to be a move away from a monastic and consecration centered church culture to a clerical and managerial culture. I'm I'm not a historian. I'm taking a very low resolution view of church history there and trying to see over centuries what may have unfolded. And there will be all sorts of ways in which that historiography will have shortcomings, but I nonetheless stick by the fact that I think it does have some explanatory power for how we arrived where we are now. And I certainly think that, as you alluded to, the divorce of the practice of theology from prayer and and essentially the consecrated life has undermined the discipline very, very seriously, and that's something perhaps not unique to the West, but it seems to be particularly acute in Latin Christianity. So I'll just park that for a moment. Um, I should say, just as a caveat, I wouldn't want anyone to think that I was anti-scholastic. Sorry, you can probably hear my dog scratching away in the corner there. Um, I'm not in any way anti-scholastic. My first book, The World as God's Icon, was an extended defense of Thomas Aquinas, with a view to try and convincing my readership that many of his own classical sources were not being taken seriously enough in the overall reception of Aquinas, particularly in the modern age. What I do think is that even Aquinas needs to be emancipated, as it were, from um, a rationalistic characterization of him that has been imposed on him by a number of people. And I was very happy when Oz Justi Press published the book Thomistic Mystagogy by Hannon. I have it here on my desk. Yeah, that's a very good example of where people are trying, I think, to retrieve this. So what's my main concern here? And why am I involving Hermetic thought? Well, there seems to me a long-standing distinction throughout church history. You can look at the Alexandrian school, Clement making the distinction between epistic and Gnostic Christianity. Here, not meant as in the heresy of Gnosticism, but Christian gnosis. Gnosis is a word that's used 29 times in the New Testament, and only once is it used pejoratively, when Saint Paul refers to the false gnosis. So the notion that we have to attain to this deep gnosis, this deep wisdom, that is a kind of passive reception of the divine mysteries rather than a discursive encounter with them, is something that belongs to certain distinctions in the history of the church. And of course, you get this again in cropping up in Newman in the Grammar of Assent, when he's distinguishing between notional and real assent. It is one thing to say the second person of the Holy Trinity incarnated, died for my sins and rose again. It is another thing to say the second person of the Holy Trinity is the reality of my life, and my whole life unfolds because of him, and it is only meaningful and purposive insofar as it is united to him. Those are both alluding to the same mysteries, to the same mystery, but and they're both pointed towards the same mystery, but there is a very clear distinction of attitudinal stance there. And actually, one might say, following, I think, the first letter to Timothy, I think it is, that notional assent only gets you as far as the knowledge that even the devil has, right? What?
No,
So,
I basically wrote here, notional assent is not an assent of faith.
right.
Is
Okay.
actually what I
Yeah.
put. Is actually
Right.
because it's not a supernatural assent. But go on. I'm just like it's like I'm kind of like trying to scroll my notes because
Yeah.
you're also giving me
Sure.
headlights. So,
Sure.
which is fine. Go on.
So what is the difference of attitudinal stance? Well, according to Thomas, the difference is charity, right? When the devil says Jesus is the Son of God, and the Christian says Jesus is the Son of God, there is clearly a qualitative difference between these two statements, and the difference is charity.
Well, technically,
Yeah, go
even
on.
it's the difference is even like at the level of the habit that's involved here, right? You're never even into just unformed faith, and I don't want to get into that faith separated from charity kind of debate from scholasticism, but
Mhm.
faith itself as a supernatural habitus already enables a kind of personal, like speaking God back to God is how I try to
Yes.
put it to my students.
Hmm.
So I even want to push that like the faith of that the devils have is this sort of it's like rationalistic assent. I will concede that
Okay.
because it's at the level
Interesting.
of just reason, is how most of the later Thomists talk about it. So there's a way in which
That
me
is interesting.
issuing a certain corrective there is actually, in a certain sense, I think, even conceding something in a direction that you could probably run with
No,
interesting thoughts
no,
on.
no.
So
Thank you for
now
that
it's natural for
refinement of the point.
and it's natural for faith to kind of impel then toward charity because you've apprehended a truth that like you described it beautifully
Mhm.
that this is the whole thing I stake my life on is that this is the life the soul of my soul. And so I'm going to respond to that not only by way of a kind of assent that's at the level of speaking truth, but of doing and in a certain sense being truth.
Right,
So
right, right.
faith kind of has an impulse toward hope and charity. But anyway, continue.
Hmm.
I just want to. I mean, it's a way of
No, no,
trying to
no.
use the. Yeah.
That's a helpful refinement of the point. I thank you. Um, it seems to me that these distinctions that recur in different idioms down the history of the church are all different ways of trying to express the doctrinal mystagogical distinction that we opened with. Um, Now, I made this point to you before that when we spoke privately, that I was amazed looking through the directory of catechesis that I think was issued in 2020, which is a pretty big document. It's actually, I wrote it down somewhere. It's 428 articles altogether. Okay.
You're a man who punishes himself. But please go on.
Well, of those 428 articles, there are, I think, six that uh, even mention mystagogical
Oh,
transformation.
that breaks my heart. I mean, I don't even think of it, but no, that's bad. That's go on.
And all of which kind of mention it in passing, apart from one, which is Article 291, which happens to be the section on the Eastern churches. So, so this is almost this is almost like the directory for catechesis basically admitting that it turns out Latin Christianity has nothing to offer on the question of mystagogy. Now, I just don't believe that.
That's
I
just
just
no, it's just garbage. It's
no,
garbage because I
it's
have to
yeah,
fight that. I have to fight that in the East when people in the East
right,
make these claims. And I find myself defending the Latin West, even though it's not my home anymore, for this
sure.
reason. And yet they sometimes make it hard for me because of
Well,
things like this.
like
So
this,
go on.
exactly so. Um, Now, and there's an extended quotation to support the point made in that article from a document from the Congregation for the Oriental Churches. So that's apparently all we have to offer here. So to conclude a point I've been developing for too long now, there seems to me that it seems to me this is the primary issue here. The crisis of mystagogy in it, particularly in the Latin Church. Now, um, I just have to be honest about where I found succor in this regard. It was through studying Tomberg, and this is why, for all the reservations that people have about Tomberg and his anthroposophical and theosophical background and his devotedness to Steiner early on in life, although he by the time he writes his later works, he's extremely critical of Steiner, even perhaps more than I would be. But people, for all sorts of reasons, have criticisms, many of which are well founded. But it was reading and rereading and studying and trying to live the unfortunately named Meditations on the Tarot by Valentin Tomberg that initiated me into a mystagogical Christianity um, to a depth that I had been seeking for some time. And Tomberg says that the purpose of this is to live with spirits, is to live with the saints and the angels, right? Is for them to be real in one's life. And I remain, profoundly grateful to him for that. Now, Hermeticism, Hermetic Christianity, it has a very, or Christian Hermeticism, baptized Hermeticism, whatever you want to call it, it has a complicated history in the church. I was reading a paper which I dug out, I have on my desk here, by David Pareca. He's a medievalist professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada, who wrote a paper called Albertus Magnus and Hermes Trismegistus, in which he goes through all the various ways that Albert uses Hermetic texts in his own writings, and I think he collects 98 or 99 various uh, excerpts where Albert is engaging with Hermetic texts, and only a very small handful of them is he quoting them in a negative way or criticizing them. Often he's calling upon them as authorities to argue for points he's making, sometimes even for arguments he's developing in favor of an exegetical point, a point on Holy Scripture. So one of the advantages, it seems to me, of Hermetic thought is that it has this precedent in it of dialogue with Orthodox, small O Orthodox Christianity. Um, and Tomberg has struck me, at least, as a very important um, development of that tradition, uh, conveying it in a very serious way. And I don't. I'm sure it's not for everybody. But when one receives a great gift, one wants to share it with those whom it might benefit. So that's my take on that. In any case.
Yeah. So I know that this has come across in some of the Anon accounts that have that sort of launched at me when everything happened in August or September. Effectively, my accusing Minard of being fearful, and yet there's a part of me that thinks, is it nonetheless my native conservatism step by step? So before maybe we even address that, because I've got some thoughts about sources in that, but I have to admit that there was a real pathos that even came to me as you told the story of your encounter with this. So it's clear to me that this really is um, this is subjectively, and I don't mean that in the negative sense of subjectively. I mean, as for this subject, for this supposit, for this person, and for others too,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, um, this encounter with him or Morello and others has been very, I mean, for like truly formative for your Christian vision. In a certain sense, wrenched you out of the, um, I mean, the non-mystagogical, the non-enculturated, the half-blind Catholicism, to be honest. I mean, a half-blind might be fully blind, right?
Mm-hmm.
Catholicism in many ways that we've inherited. So, like, I mean, really, like a real pathos, as you told it. Like, I mean, I have the sense of a piety that's there. Um, that's not quite comparable to to sort of the feeling I have to Maritain, who made me a Thomist, because in a certain sense that didn't hit the deepest root. I'm not quite sure what does my taproot of if I had a full taproot conversion down into my Catholicism the same way. My experience for several years as a Benedictine is more diffuse, so it might be just more diffuse to sort of get to places that are, I think, those parts of my soul that are able to understand you and prevent me from being too much of a scholastic. So like just I'm recognizing sort of that. But so before talking about, these sort of danger things and questions around what would be danger, or who is this for, right? It may work for
Mm-hmm.
Morello, does it work for the masses? Um I'm gonna just back up a tiny bit from this because it's on my mind and I don't want to miss it because I think it's at the heart of so much of what you're thinking about. A huge part of the ill here is, of course, that there's a culture that's missing, right? So I'm not trying to end run and say, look, this is, I think, where my mind is going implicitly. Well, Morello needed that now, but if it was a healthier Latin church, he wouldn't have needed this. I'm not saying that, but I mean, that's probably the logic of the argument to a degree that's underneath the surface. And so I don't want to make that argument, actually. I just want to stay at a certain level, though, of even
But
the effect.
but can I
Yes.
just rudely interrupt? If you did make that point, I would agree with it. One of the things that I lament is the fact that um, we have lost the temporal aspect of the church. We've lost a Christendom, and so we're all kind of groping about in the dark all the time, trying to find all sorts of ways of compensating for the fact that what the church is supposed to do, which is seize the principality of Satan and hand that territory over to the kingdom of Christ so that we can all flourish in liturgical nations, that whole mission has been corroded and eroded through various complex historical events. Um, and you can point to the Reformation, you can point to 1789, you can point to 1848, you can point to any date and say that's where the rot really set in. But the fact is, um, there's been this receding of the church from its mission to sanctify the temporal arena, and that's left people like you and me, namely lay people who are indigenous to the temporal arena, rather at sea. And
Yeah.
so we're all having to scramble about and find those sources that will enable us to live fully of our discipleship in the context in which we found ourselves, which isn't an enviable one, I think.
Yeah, a couple different directions they can go. It's kind of like taking the transfiguration that is supposed to happen to the whole of creation and just clipping it off is what it's
Mm,
like,
mm, mm,
right? That's what it
mm.
is by creating a certain secularity that's just impermeable to the effects of the kingdom of God upon the kingdom of times, the
Yes.
kingdom of eras or whatever you want to say. Um,
But
yeah, I
sorry, I
just
interrupted.
no, no, it's fine because it's like these are all kind of deeply related, right? That people should see that we've got, I think some people who would be less disposed to wanting to listen to us charitably here are going to hear just the integralism component. That's sort of like a theoretic element to this, but it's a real question of the Christianization of culture. Obviously, that includes the question of the church-state relations and those issues. It's connected though to like, I mean, profound sense of, to in what way is a culture Christianized? In what way does that occur institutionally? In what way does that arise with regard to the kind of highest practical act, which is, liturgy in the broadest sense, right? Because you and I share, I think we use that expression, and yet I think we're both sensitive to the fact that when you say liturgy, some people just hear valid masses. I mean,
Right.
right? But we mean something far more capacious. That's both the liturgy of, the not only the whole liturgical cycle of the church, but then like the liturgy of life that comes from that of a Christianized imagination and culture with the semiosis of a shared Christian space where you can't touch anything in your daily life without seeing how it's connected ultimately to the
Exactly.
web of Christian existence. And like
It's
that's
what
all,
it's what
yeah.
Aidan Nichols calls the liturgy after the liturgy.
Yeah, and he may be taking that from Schmemann,
Right.
actually.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Um, so like all of this is more of me just saying like I see like in a certain sense that it's like what you said. I mean, we're all groping about trying to figure out how to deal with this. Yeah, I don't have a response because I see in my mind, reading you in the abstract and not knowing you personally, which is of course a dangerous thing then to do for public performances. But we all do public performances, right? In a certain sense, your initial articles were public performances as well.
Hmm.
um, it's easy to have a creed occur that's reactionary, and I don't know what I am. Like I feel like in a certain sense, I share this reactionary sense. Like someone from the outside would look at me and say everything you do with you is reactionary. Like it doesn't make sense in view of the secular mores. Um, and yet like something I said in the article it was definitely coming from my pen, and it was probably a little too spicy. It was like, well, we live in the church of today, and we can't just reconstruct something of the past. I don't know. Sebastian, I'm more. You feel more like someone who's like an Oxbridge debater who's carefully thought through his words and takes his time to say them so that it's everything lands correctly. I'm musing out loud, to be honest,
Well,
right
well,
now.
Dr. Miner, maybe you could just respond directly to the use of Tomberg Meditations of the
I
Terror.
know. Well, I know, but there's a sense in which that's going to now take us down a path that then will be, I mean, where we have to go. But okay, so I want us to come back to this, Sebastian, because I think it's the more constructive. It's the more constructive point of it's like there's the what do we do question that's underneath all this, and so I guess let's start with the particular in that. So to me. I guess, because I look, I'm not trying to be a localist who sort of says, here's my life and what can I do? But, for me, the liturgical life of my family becomes the one thing I can influence. Like I've been taught for 40 years as a Catholic, there's very little else I can influence. I mean, even for my students at the seminary, there's only so much you can teach because they seem to learn in order to forget sometimes. And I love my students. But nonetheless, that's what my novice master said to us kind of in frustration as an 80-some-year-old. He said, I learned after teaching for many years that they learn in order to forget. Um, but so, okay, so there's the question, well, what do you do? What are the practices? And I mean, obviously, you're not building an entire Catholicism out of Tomberg, right? It's clear that,
Sure.
the celebration of the liturgy, the traditional Latin Mass, the Roman Rite as it has been for centuries, with all the bits, all of that is kind of part of the informing of your imagination. But like to land on maybe it's just a little bit too clunky of a point. To me, it's at the universal level of what's recommended is we can't just say read books and they're going to fix things, right? So
Sure.
I don't think either of us are going to say you're going to come with your source of folks and I'm going to come with my list, and we actually are just saying, oh, if people just read these, they're going to fix them, right? But at the center of a kind of like mysticism that's grounded for me, kind of just to choose out of the East and West things that are dear more or less to my mind, I think, well, instead of stuff that's close to sociology, theosophy, and anthroposophy, which I get the connections to, and I even see the connections to what I'm about to say, especially the Rhineland mystics. Why
Mm-hmm.
not instead at the center are, Thaler, Suso, in a certain sense, even Eckhart read through the lens of those
Mm-hmm.
later views,
Yep.
right? Because they're
Yeah.
sort of the cleaned up version of Eckhart. Um, one could say the Carmelites. I mean, and I'm not meaning to be dismissive. I mean, it was sort of how to put it. The Carmelite mystics were the coin of the realm last century. So I feel like sometimes they crowd everyone out. But, Carmelite mysticism in the East, you can think of, I mean, a whole series of kind of Athonite spirituality, especially, after the collapse, right? Because there's a
Yeah.
sense in which the Philoclean spirituality and it's actually sort of ground it somewhat, to be honest, is more asceticism in many ways, right? It's ascetical writings just as much as it's mystical writings. Although that too, right? A kind of, an engagement with the tradition and in its ascetical form as well as sort of if you had to have books, for lack of a better way to do this, books that sort of are the canonical texts that are recommended, right? So if there's a Christian gnosis, which is too ancient of an idea to deny, right? It is
Mm-hmm.
part of the vocabulary
Sure.
that comes down, and there's a kind of fight for how to understand that gnosis, how intellectualistic or not, because there's sort
Mm.
of you see that battle in the Orthodox world last century that there's a sort of backing away from Evagrius that happens, and sometimes
Yeah.
the sort of the Benedictine in me sees some of the reason for that, even though in another way Evagrius remains important, right? But there's an intellectualism of a certain Platonism that you yourself avoid, and yet a certain kind of reading of especially the more hermetic side of the things you talk about can lead to just the same kind of intellectualism that's not kind of embodied in my opinion. But that's
Sure.
so I'm saying, so you need like the canon has to have sort of this whole experience at the church, which I would want to say this sounds like a total conservative. Why not draw from these saints, or at least we'll say in the case of some of them, saint adjacent figures, thinking of poor Eckhart, or even in
No,
this
sure.
instance of Evagrius, right? So that's, I mean, that's a
I
way
think
of me putting it.
I
Without trying to
think
just come across the board and say, Sebastian, why don't you throw those books away and take these ones? That's the simple form of me trying to
no,
talk around it nervously.
I get it. I get the case, and look, I do think in the book Mysticism, Magic, and Monasteries, I quote. I think I quote the Rhineland mystics. I quote Hildegard von Bingen. I quote her repeatedly because she's had such a big influence on me over the years. Um, I have a great devotion to the saints. I talk about the importance of the Franciscan tradition in retrieving the ancient patristic idea of creation as sacrament, which I think was being eclipsed at that period and was retrieved in a very creative way by Francis and then his followers. So I'm not the case in the book is certainly not. Uh, don't worry about the saints. We've got Valentine Tomberg. That's not the argument. Rather, I'm simply saying if people are surprised by the role that he plays in my writings, well, my thought is saturated with his thought because he had this influence on me. So um, it's by way of an apologia that I'm indicating why he plays that central role in the things I have to say. I think the thing that we might be slightly tap dancing around here is, uh, which is the thing that I think has upset certain people, is just the fact that I deploy the word magic.
Well, and
Um,
I'm writing down here. I have crystals and magic written down
right,
precisely because
exactly.
I know a very balanced good priest. I mean, he's a really good man who has noted what he's even referred to as sort of like a conveyor belt from traditionalism to just real actual new age stuff.
Right, right. Yeah,
Right. And I
yeah.
do think he's pointing to a reality. I mean, he's
Hmm.
just a good servant of the church, this man.
Sure, sure.
Uh, yeah. And I do think it's touching on something real. And I think that's at
Hmm.
least what put my teeth on edge. Whether or not your first critic's teeth were for that reason or just for polemics, we don't have to settle
Sure, sure, sure.
that.
No,
Yeah.
no,
So
no,
go
no.
on. That's, yeah.
Um,
But I understand the word magic could be used. It's also a coin of the kind of re-enchantment discussion nowadays, right? To talk about it.
well,
This spell to drive out the spells of modernity. Like yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's true that sometimes I deploy the term in a more metaphorical sense, but actually, a lot of the times that people think I'm being metaphorical, I'm actually not. Like when I say that modernity and rationalism and the oscillation of the modern mind between a kind of sentimentalism or romanticism and an inordinate abstractionism, and this constant oscillation between the two and you see, and this is completely a disease in the church. You mentioned it earlier.
Hmm.
It's like there's another catechetical program will save the church, and then suddenly we're just going to organize paraliturgies where everyone can just emote in front of somebody singing a kind of stylized pop song that deploys the word Jesus occasionally. And if we just kind of oscillate between these two things constantly, then somehow we're going to reintegrate ourselves as well as recipients of gnosis, and that's not working, right? Because it's actually following the exact same pattern of the modern fragmentation of the mind. Now, that when I call that a hex, I mean it. I think that that's a kind of demonic um, black magic that has captured the modern mind and
Demons are
need.
real.
Demons are
And may
real,
Saint Michael
and they
protect us. Yeah.
yeah, and
No.
they mess with our minds, and they
Hmm.
can do that on a very wide scale. Particularly if we take all of our corporate persons of political formations, nations, kingdoms, and we place them all back under the principality of Satan, and then start murdering old people and babies and doing everything that you would expect to do in a demonic principality, then believe me, that's a really good way to invite demons into your mind, to mess with your minds and disintegrate them. So it shouldn't surprise us that that's happening. It's just very, very tragic to see that unfolding at a accelerating pace in the church, right? So when I talk about black magic and hexes of that kind, I really mean it, and I really do think those spells need to be broken. Now, Iamblichus, of whom I'm a albeit critical admirer, um, it goes to great pains in his work on the mysteries of the Egyptians to distinguish between Goetia and Theurgia. That Goetia is the cooperation of human beings with angelic agency, specifically diabolical fallen angelic agency, for the sake of accumulating real or apparent power. And I think, generally speaking, it's apparent. I don't think it works. Famously, in my own country, John Dee, the original 007, discovered this when he handed his whole life over to demons, thinking he was communicating with angels, and it ended up destroying his family. Everyone stopped trusting him, ruined his marriage, and he ended up dying an embittered, starving, pauper. That's what you get for siding with demons, right? Um, Now, Iamblichus distinguishes Goetia from Theurgia, which is um, the the union of persons with beatific blessed angels, so as to be that part of the cosmos that is rationally participating in the creative act of God, so that in oneself the cosmos can be offered back to God, the effect of which, according to Iamblichus, is the union of the created will with the uncreated will, so as to effect good in the world and participate in God's intention for the world. And it's really this theurgia, it's really this that Tomberg is referring to when he uses that phrase sacred magic. So when I use the term, I'm using it in a Tombergian sense. And the what makes it sacred is that it is baptized. And the argument that I make in the book is that Theurgia unbaptized is always going to go wrong because it's still under Satan's principality, right? It's dangerous. It's very, very dangerous. Theurgia baptized is another way of talking about what the church is doing liturgically.
That's exactly what I wanted to ground it. Like, now give me what are the specific acts of such a Christian theurgy?
Right.
Yeah, to be, we in the East, well enough. Just even just thinking of just our Cherubicon or the version of that during our pre-sanctified liturgies, right? I mean, the sense in the liturgy, though, West and East, of being, you're among the heavenly hosts,
Yes.
right? I mean, that's the place where it efficaciously happens because we're not ginning it up. Except
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that, through our characters of baptism and orders, respectively, and according to our own orders, that we are actively in a way taken up into this,
Yes.
right? So we're not just
Exactly.
passive in a kind of pure way.
And this is the main issue because I this is the reason I want to use this language, which I understand might seem novel, but Dionysius the Areopagite is using the term theurgy in order to try and work out what the Christian is doing when the Christian is fully himself, and so there is some precedent for speaking in this way, but I think we have seriously lost the sense in the church that of a coherent doxological anthropology, that the Christian is fully the Christian when the Christian is in a state of adoration and worship in union with the saints and the angels. That is when the Christian comes into himself, as it were. And so this is, um, I feel like the church has gone through a stage of such aggressive rupture that we have to think of new creative ways of talking about the church's ancient tradition, just so to initiate people back into the mind of the church, because the many of the how shall I say this? Many of the ways that have become common in recent centuries aren't working anymore. The language isn't it doesn't initiate us into it anymore, and so we have to be we have to be creative, and we have to undergo a kind of archaeological exercise where we retrieve some of the really ancient sources that formed a common vernacular in the church at various times and can be retrieved in a kind of, dare I say, entrepreneurial way, um, to advance the church's mission here and now. And I suppose in that respect, I'm a bit like you. I'm not reactionary in that respect. In that respect, I'm very much trying to take stock of the situation in which we're in and thinking about how to creatively deal with it. I am reactionary in another sense. And I suppose I'll just finish with a quick response to that because it comes up in the document a few times. Look, in a talk that I delivered in Italy not too long ago, I talked about the Vedic idea. Well, it's not Vedic, but the Hindu idea of the Kali Yuga, and I read a passage from the Bhagavata Purana about what the Kali Yuga really is, and you know, like so many ancient traditions, like the Neoplatonic tradition, the Hindu texts identify the universe not as mechanical and purposeless and meaningless with its self-enclosed laws in a kind of Newtonian fashion. They identify the cosmos as living, as a living organism with a soul. generated from the creative act of God, the queen consort of God, if you like. And like any living being, the universe, the cosmos, is born, has a kind of vigorous youth, comes to maturity, and then becomes frail and begins to die. And the Kali Yuga is the death of the cosmos. Rene Guénon thought that the Kali Yuga process began 5,000 years ago. In any case, you have these sort of Catholic theorists like Robert Bolton and others who have suggested that this is a way to understand the universe from a pre-scientific revolution perspective that identifies the age in which we're living as really not just, it's not even that the cosmos is dying anymore, it's that it's died and it's decomposing. And what you should expect to see is that being lived out in the highest part of the cosmos, which is human beings and in our cultures. And our cultures look the way they do because we're trapped in a state of cosmic disintegration, decomposition. And maybe this is what we should expect to see before the resurrection of the cosmos, when heaven and earth are brought together and all things are made new at the final judgment and the final resurrection. But in any case, I look around at post-Christian cultures, and I'm so scandalized by what I see. I find what I behold so appalling that the only way for me to remain sane is to live in a state of constant adversarial reaction. And that is exhausting, but it's better than being a kind of screen addicted sex zombie, which I think is probably a definition of modern man. So, in that sense, I am reactionary. But anyway, there's a lot there.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So I'm gonna latch on to try and like heighten the contradictions, like to get us to a point, right?
Yeah.
And this doesn't, I don't know if it exactly works with regard to the metaphor you drew from Hinduism. So it's not necessarily directed to that,
Hmm, hmm.
but whether it's especially in its pagan form, which is of course not post-Christian, right? I mean, there's a sense that you're never going back to paganism because it's not the same thing post-Christian,
Sure,
right?
sure.
But the pagan form of broadly Hermetic thought, whoever we want to attach it to, Iamblichus,
Hmm,
or to the line from Hermes or others,
hmm.
or sources from outside of Christianity, from spiritual traditions which are a mixture of both, whatever God's will is doing by way of even supernatural causality in cultures outside of the gospel. It's also a dangerous and mixed world of both the demonic and the graced. And I think we've lived through a period of Catholicism where I think they found too much grace sometimes outside of Christianity, to be honest,
Hmm.
um, because it was it's all the rage of interreligious dialogue to
Sure.
try and find the seeds of the gospel without the weeds that are around the seeds is all. And if
Yes.
you look in the article I wrote, I mean, I made sure to put a long footnote about, listen, I mean, even Maritain and Garrigou give room for supernatural mysticism outside the church. It's going to be really rare. So I'm just making clear to the people listening, this is not just sort of just full dismissiveness. It's not what I'm trying to engage in.
Sure.
But I think of an image that's, I think, from the beginning of the triads that St. Gregory Palamas writes against Barlaam of Calabria, where he talks about, he uses the image of the snake for philosophy in this case. And it's there are bits of the snake that might be useful medicinally, but you have to do a lot of work to cut the venom out. You get the idea that it's definitely not like how a scholastic is going to talk about using philosophy. I sort of think there's a real truth to this, even because I think about some of there's a whole narrative I could give of the rationalism that comes downstream of Aristotelianism that I actually think is a kind of overzeal for Aristotelianism, right?
Hmm.
That I could tell that tale, that it was a bewitchment of the Christian imagination by the philosophers. I mean, I could, yeah, more and more of my time in the East, I feel comfortable saying that because I know that I'm committed enough to the other stuff I hold that I'm not just sort of coming up with a sort of ignorant narrative you get in that
Sure.
regard.
Sure.
So I really do. I do think there's a real insight there. And I feel like there's sometimes a Western way of reading like Augustine's words about the philosophers and not taking seriously enough his critiques of philosophical culture, right? There's a certain kind of good kid Catholic who just so wants to have a voice in the public square that they want to just emphasize the use of philosophy, right?
Yeah.
So I'm using the philosophy example because it's closer to some of the kind of patristic sources, or at least the spiritual sources, right? But something similar could be said for things from other religions. Um, and because, so that's like me thinking of like the notion of theurgy, which has a kind of mixed pedigree, right?
Hmm.
There's a certain sense of theurgy, like retroped into the new meaning of liturgical theurgy that you and I 100% were able to agree on. But there's also a sense of casting people out into a language and a tradition, which is not just difficult, which might be the way of saying, hey, is this just for intellectuals, right? Like Minard and Morello can read this stuff and benefit from it, but let's not have the hoi polloi, even a little bit more deeply. I mean, that there's even mixed in with the search for, true theurgy versus magic, within an Egyptian context, right? You're still in a context that's not fully baptized. It's a
Sure.
tradition of a kind of seed of truth about theurgy that has within it the potential virtualities of how to put it. Here's what it is. The choice is like to become Morello, positive, or for perhaps many, Helena Blavatsky.
Yeah.
Right. And for those who don't know, this is sort of sophiology, theosophy theosophy, especially at the turn of the 20th century. And just to, I guess, to give an example of like why I think that's a threat, right? I was translating De Revelatione by Garrigou. And at the end, after doing sort of all the standard sort of against rationalism, et cetera, things about Revelation, because he sort of deals with it in itself and then does the external critique. He then gets into a very turn of the century like discussion of like mesmerism or hypnotism. And I'm like,
Hmm.
goodness, I was like, it's painful, right? I'm thinking like, and then Blavatsky, and I'll be honest, at the time, I'm not really head down into anything related to this conversation. Like I laugh when I tell people about how much I've had to talk about Hermeticism. And if you've noticed, if you watch any of my podcasts of late, how many times Jakob Böhme comes up in my
Right.
podcast?
Interesting. Interesting.
um, because it's on my mind, because it's like you're sort of both aware of resonances and dangers.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm reading this stuff, he's critiquing Blavatsky, and I'm like, this feels like such, turn of the century concerns. Well, then I remember I went on, I don't even know why I searched Amazon, and I saw there was some publisher that had, they'll have these breakout stores where you probably are a good man who doesn't give money to the machine the way that we Americans do, right? We're too sold in. But it has like a store setup. Like it's like sort of the whatever the series of republications of Blavatsky's works. And
Yeah.
it's done up nicely, right? Like someone's done sort of the art for the background, and you have the blurbs are kind of done like in a marketing sense. And at the time, this is a few years back now, I thought, what in the world? I was like, I guess this is just the Oprah Book Club version of this thing coming back. Now, the more I think of it, and the more I've thought about the role for both good and ill of sociology and anthroposophy in the Orthodox world, right? I mean, it's a tale for good and ill, and it's affected all of Orthodoxy down to our day. I mean, even
Sure.
the neo-patristic rejection of all of that, it's still very much it's still got the spirit of Soloviev and Berdyaev and
Yeah.
Bulgakov there. And I think that there's a certain need to especially in the case of I think Bulgakov and Berdyaev, but even Bulgakov, to sort of deal with the good stuff that's there in a way that was rejected too quickly in the 30s.
Yes, I
Um,
agree. Yeah.
so, but there was a danger that was there quite clearly seen, I
Yeah.
think, by the Orthodox in that case, right? That this tends off in the direction of, and then it becomes a question of what is it, right? Is it? I mean, it doesn't have to be. Hermeticism is this term that we've been throwing around since you've had the benefit of pushing that into the space, right? This is one of the things you've influenced the dialogue space. But the word Hermeticism, no one spoke of it until you brought it back. But theosophy, most people would hear this as New Age, right? And I mean,
Yeah.
there's some use to pander to that understanding, to see sort of the vague kind of vague spiritualism or whatever. And so like there's a part of me that just feels like there's not enough rhetoric that recognizes this stuff is fire because it's mixed, it's marbled through with,
Totally.
or it's like seed that has like it's got bad seed in there as well, and you got to shake this thing out like a lot. This thing has to be really shaken out in order to be Christianized. So, and
Matthew,
I'm sorry, I'm going and going
no,
because I respect this enough that I
no, no,
want to
no.
make my point.
Uh,
Yeah.
Thank you. As you're speaking, the I kept on thinking of this quote from Archbishop Fulton Sheen. Fulton Sheen used to say, whatever the church throws out, the world takes up, right?
Mhm.
And this is something that I see in New Ageism. It's something I see in theosophy and anthroposophy, Steinerianism. It's something, I kind of come from a New Age background. I mean, I was an Anglican. It's very easy to be an Anglican and a New Ager. And so, and I was living out in India for quite a long time, living at various ashrams, trying various religious practices and trying to learn everything I could about Eastern mysticism and studying under various teachers and so on. I lived in Dharamsala for a long time, was a student of the Dalai Lama and the Karmapa there. And, this was my whole background is immersed in this, in a kind of a syncretism, I'd say a syncretism, which just did not take seriously the concerns that you have. They're concerns that I've developed since becoming a Catholic, 16 years ago today, in fact.
Oh my goodness.
Um,
God, yeah, God be
yeah.
praised. God grant you many blessed years.
So uh, I understand the concerns, but I think it's important to recognize that, for example, the entire tradition of analyzing the sacred geometry of Gothic architecture and the role that Neoplatonic mystery schools and the way that was interpreted by Abbot Sugur in the High Middle Ages and everything that's that was being that interest in our architectural tradition, which is not insignificant. It's not window dressing. I mean, it was through our architectural tradition that people were mystagogically transformed for hundreds of years, right? Being in these buildings and being taught by them. That really began with Fulcanelli at the end of the 19th century, who was a kind of, like a new age, he was an alchemist, basically. No one even really knows who Falconelli was. He only appeared in public a few times, and he always wore a mask and a hood whenever he appeared. And all of his closest followers swore oaths to always keep his identity secret. And there's been vast amounts of speculation ever since about who exactly this guy was. But he wrote this great work called The Mystery of the Cathedrals on the great Gothic cathedrals of France. And that's what began all of this interest, all the way down to our current day. The great works written on Chartres Cathedral by Keith Critchlow, who was also architectural advisor to our King Charles III. His student, my friend Tom Bree, who wrote Cosmos in Stone about the sacred geometry and architectural principles of Wells Cathedral. All of this work is completely neglected by mainstream Catholicism, by the way. No one cares. Nobody cares, right? But this is our tradition. This is our tradition. And because the church threw it out, the world took it up. And all these weird syncretists and New Agers became fascinated in this stuff. And now we're having to retrieve it back, right?
Hmm.
And whilst I recognize, of course I recognize, that when you're siphoning through this stuff, there is a constant danger of being led astray. I see a danger that is equal in weight and perhaps even graver, that all of these things that are our religious birthright are just handed over to New Agers who actually long for the destruction of the church. They despise institutional religion. That's almost the one thing that unites the disparate categories of New Ageism is this one thing that they absolutely loathe institutional
Hmm.
religion, which they identify chiefly with the Catholic Church. We just give it all to them. That now becomes their spirituality, and our entire religious inheritance is given up for uh, concrete spaceship churches and if I were a butterfly, if I were a fuzzy wuzzy bear, these kind of 1960s hymns and things, you know that's what we get instead, right? So
That's
when
that's what y'all get. That's what y'all
yeah,
get in the West.
well
Sorry.
that's
No,
that
it takes one generation to get messed up. Cardinal Roach was made the head of or made a consultator in the East, and I'm filled with fear. So I
Well, exactly. I mean, this is the thing. You are in an enviable position, in that you have in the context in which we found ourselves, you've nonetheless managed to find an ancient treasury of liturgical practice and spiritual practice, which is constantly being chipped away at. Um,
and it happened with us. I mean, and I'm
sure,
doing it
no,
in
I
a
know.
context where our architecture is okay, right?
Yes,
In the churches, luckily locally, but we had a mess in America in the 50s where we
right,
had our churches modernized in the Ruthenian church even.
right,
So,
right.
but
No,
we've been
sure,
backing
sure.
away from that blessedly, even in those places. But anyway, I'm just recognizing that it's not really
Right.
that
Well, we
separate.
seem to be doubling down on it. So
Mhm.
it's uh, I I I do think that it's very like one of the reasons I am so profoundly grateful, not only to Tom Berg, but to that entire kind of how do you want to call it, the Catholic re-enchantment movement. Jean Borella, Wolfgang Smith, Jean Hanny, Stratford Caldecott, all of these thinkers who are undergoing this remarkable work of really retrieving our deep tradition. And that means being in creative, sometimes adversarial dialogue with sources that are either outside the Catholic fold or that have appropriated aspects of our tradition that actually, frankly, we want back. I'm really grateful for the work that they've done, and I very much see myself in that tradition. And the book I'm writing at the moment is on the ancient Christian idea of cosmos as theophany.
Mhm.
That uh, one of the things that I've been criticised for, and if I'm
Dr.
Yeah.
use
Morello.
of the
Oh,
Wait,
okay. Oh,
go.
you just
Yeah.
froze for a second. You were about to say one of the things I've been criticized for, and then you froze.
oh
Just
oh
start
dear,
over.
but one of the things I've been criticised for, and in fact, um, one of the things that the 33-page document I think unfairly criticises me for is the use of the word emanation. But really, I mean, the Catholic understanding, the Christian understanding of creation is not that the creation is an artifact of God. It's something that he makes, like a builder makes a house. It's an emanation of his own inner life. When Thomas Aquinas in what is it, Article 30. No, yes, it's Article 45 of the Prima Pars, when he asks himself, what is creation? When he gives his own answer, he uses the word emanation 7 times. It struck me as surprising to be criticised for that, because it seems to me that the retrieval of the notion of the created order as a true emanation, as true theophany, is something that desperately needs to be retrieved. Because, of course, practically speaking, the upshot is, if we don't, is we go through an ongoing process of uglification. Right, we don't want to participate in this notion of the created order as theophany. We just reduce it all to stuff that can be subordinated to utility. You think about Leonardo da Vinci's description of the created order as this great living being who's responding to God, who's worshipping God, that the seas are this being's blood, that the mountains and the rocks are this being's bones, and he kind of just, and then you think about just a couple of centuries later, or a century and a half later, you think about Francis Bacon saying, nature is this harlot who we should rape over and over again, is his exact words. Those two quotes should be sufficient to indicate that those indicate two very different attitudinal stances towards the created order. One is understanding the created order as sacrament and theophany, another as just stuff, with which we have a purely utility-based arrangement. Um, and it worries me that a lot of Christians think about the created order in the latter way. And by doing that, I think they offend the one who authors the created order as a true emanation of his inner life. And so, that kind of work, which, because we threw that out, the New Agers and the re-enchanters and so on have all taken that up. Well, no, I'm sorry, that's our cosmology, and so I want it back. Um,
Well,
Well,
and
we've
so,
got about 10
yeah,
more minutes. Dr. Miner, do you want to respond to any of that
yeah,
and give some final comments?
yeah, and then yeah, then I guess we'll have to land the plane. Like the word emanation. I mean, yeah, you're absolutely correct. First of all, I mean, that it's very potentially subject to a Christian sense and was used just to use the source in question by Thomas. It's used to deal with the causal relationship, the both efficient and formal or extrinsic formal causal relationship that God has with creation. Um, that if you think about the state of the discourse when we wrote that article, I'm aware of there's baggage of the word emanation, and if it's not sort of within if it's a really bad image. I feel like it's a word that's like a cow that's going to be veal, that it has to be in one of those containers where they keep the baby, strapped so it can't move around too much. Like it needs to be supported kind of within a dogmatic framework of Christianity to not be subject to some of the emanationism. Like I'm going to be super sensitive to this because my initial training, being kind of 13th century Western stuff, is aware of, the Arabized emanation schemes of cosmology, like intermediaries and all of that, right? Like a kind of seeing how the notion of emanation can get out from underneath of you in a kind of unhealthy pantheism. I've always told my wife, pantheism actually should always be a temptation for a good spirituality because of the proximity of God through his threefold causality, right?
sure.
Both his presence of immensity, his presence of grace, and his presence in the hypostatic union, and how they're all interrelated. But there's a logic of emanation that can scare one, and I'll admit that maybe we're being, in the article, very concerned. Whose emanationism, right, is
Well,
this? And we
right, but
knew,
and I
yeah.
agree with that. But given that I wrote a whole book on the Thomistic conception of emanation prior to writing this book, not just your document, but I think that for those who knew that, there could have been an assumption that I was defending the Thomistic conception of emanation
I'll
rather
be
than
honest. I
anything
took
else.
that to be at the time. I was thinking of it like your exoteric teaching about something you wanted that was more nebulous and esoteric. I mean, just to be frank. I mean,
Right,
that's
right.
perhaps the reason for it. Um, the other thing though, you bring up Da Vinci. That's where I guess it's interesting thinking of some of these other bits you talk about, like the reappreciation of kind of it's like the quadrivium in many ways. I've got a guy on Twitter who's always coming out, Plato's stepchild. I often wonder if it's you. Um,
I'm
but
not on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter.
Okay, he posts so these I mean all these bits from sort of we'll just say the geometric tradition, right, and its resonance within creation, and of course you see this, so you think of like the notes of Da Vinci and everything else, as well. Uh, that there's a tale of that kind of appreciation of in this case, the mathematical side of the Hermetics is very specific. That I think goes in two ways. I mean, that even historically, using the example of the cathedrals, almost powerfully captures it. There's an instability to that element of the Hermetic tradition that can go in the direction of Christendom building cathedrals at the hands of the Masons, or Masonry and Martinism in its later form, whenever it flies off into its own sort of free floating Hermeticism. I think another example of that is Da Vinci. I actually consider already on the other side of the divide. That you're already in the way toward a kind of Pythagoreanized view of reality that really a generation later just becomes, it's just the extension that can be manipulated, right? That in the end, it's like and I think there's a good tale to be told. Tim Noon used to talk about sort of a meeting of Aristotle's posterior analytics with a kind of neo-Pythagoreanism. And why is that? Why is that? Is that just Minard sort of saying, "Oh, you're gonna like shapes and you're gonna ruin your theology"? It's not that, because I think this is something that's even in the heart of the tradition. Because do you know of that? I don't know if it's actually legitimate. The speech that Plato, he gave a speech on the good publicly, and he ends up giving this whole talk. It's there's sort of, I mean, it's we I don't even know what I forget the manuscript tradition on this guy is, right? Like how we know of this. There's some article, you can see it. It's definitely in Jay's story now, where he just does a long excursus on things mathematical, and there's probably a whole series of trying to interpret this, but this is something at the heart of Platonism, is this residue of Pythagoreanism that again I think goes off in sort of an odd way, that it has a real purchase, right? There's a real purchase on reality. There's a reason why all those books that you mentioned, when they look at architecture, they're seeing sort of the harmony of the cosmos. Like it is present there because of the way that quantity structures. This is the Thomist to me now coming out. The way that
Sure.
quantity structures as the first accident. And yet, too, it flies off in something that's as demonic as modernity, because modernity is the untethered version of this. And I'm mentioning it more because it's in the stream of even, and I'm not trying to attack Platonism, right? I would say, I'm really not trying to do. It's not about Platonism per se. It's the whole West. The whole West is downstream of Plato. That there's something in that sub branch of the Hermetic imagination concerning, quantity, the quadrivium, math, that
But
is a potential poison that has to be controlled very carefully.
I
Yeah,
completely agree. I completely agree. But the thing is that you're kind of, dare I say, you're arguing my point here. That there was a reinterpretation of reality that prioritized the calculation, measurement, and quantity, which birthed modernity. Actually, I think the ancient Platonic and Pythagorean conception of number is primarily as a qualitative dimension, that the reception of a number is what brings materia prima out of its obscurity of pure potency and brings it into reality by the reception of number, which is qualitative. It's what Wolfgang Smith calls, vertical causality. And of course, ironically, what made me very aware of this was reading René Guénon's the Reign of Quantity, right, where he traces exactly that a true initiatory conception of what this kind of hermetic tradition is can lead to this recognition of the vertical causal reception of quality, or it can move in this mathematical stuff, which, and he sees these two traditions battling it out in the Renaissance, right?
hmm
Um, and so I agree with you, but again, the way to the way to understand this discussion is to engage with these texts in a really interesting way, in a way that's completely faithful to the church, and not to not I suppose not to shout witchcraft at every
Sure, at
every
every
interest
attempt.
in these things. Yeah.
No, but I guess it's the digestion of this happens within the heart of the church, and part of the problem where we're firing past each other, the conservative in my temperament and the more syncretist in your temperament, because of our upbringings, or our
Mm-hmm.
backgrounds, we might say, not to cast aspersions on our parents. The difference is, though, it's we're both trying to say, like, okay, how do you do this where you don't have a culture, not just the culture, but I'm talking about the church herself, where it's the womb where this gets negotiated and dealt with. Right? We're trying to talk about this like it's something we're doing with texts, which neither of us are committed to actually saying
Mm-hmm.
that texts are going to save the
Sure.
world.
Sure.
When the practices of Catholicism that basically enabled the digesting of this tradition in a way that sort of was just in the bones of what was in the liturgy and the architecture, and in
Right.
the spirituality itself, happened by a living church that's not just, laymen trying to figure it out, which is not what we're saying we're really doing, but that's kind of what we're both doing, both of
Yes,
us in our own
agreed.
way.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I mean, look, one way I've tried to do that is write this book, and try to give a really faithful Orthodox Christian engagement with these challenging questions. Not with an attempt to offer an exhaustive answer, but just to indicate a way of doing that that remains completely and utterly faithful to Christian discipleship.
But it's actually in the Christian discipleship that it's done. And
Yes,
that's the
absolutely.
tragedy right now, though, is that it would be more solved by living through these, articulating it the whole time, but living through this in a healthy liturgical, spiritual, mystical environment that we don't have. I mean, even,
Well,
Yeah.
That's the point. That is exactly the point, that we are now in a situation in which you know we've uh, we've got a curia that is highly abusive of the law repeatedly, that is seizing property from old religious orders, that is enmeshed in financial and sexual corruption, that is introducing genuine religious syncretism through the Assisi days and the worship of Pachamamas, and that is protecting orders, or has done for decades until it was impossible to do so, all across the planet, that have turned out to be grooming rackets, whether it's the Institute of the Incarnate Word or Community of St. John or the Legionaries or L'Arche or whatever it is, or Rupnik or whatever. We've got widespread homosexuality among the clergy. We've got the Orthodox, small o Orthodox, constantly being ousted, and the worst sort of people seem to be promoted constantly. And now that what's left of the rich liturgical tradition of the West is being sought out and destroyed, and what that leaves people like me and many others, it leaves us traumatized, right? It leaves us traumatized and very, very confused, and so what we have to do in that situation is not only look around for what's still available to us, whether it's driving 2, 3 hours on a Sunday in order to get to an actual worthy mass, but also we have to intelligently start this process of retrieving the whole of our tradition, all of it, in its integrity, from which we've been uprooted, deracinated, and severed and divorced. And so maybe maybe this is a slightly conceited thing to do, but you know, given that I have quite extensive experience in trying to work through these things, and I've written several books, and and I have a chair at a university, and so on. I'm not perfectly suited, but I am reasonably suited to respond to some of these challenges and try to offer not an exhaustive but a tentative response to the crisis we're in, to engage in that spiritual archaeology that I was talking about.
Yeah, and I mean yeah, I have how to think of it. I suppose that there's just that one part of me that, man, you had to go. I mean, there's some significant problems. Significant problems in the hierarchy of the church, and yet it can't in the end. The end path of this is never going to be outside of a renewal within the hierarchical church.
Sure.
And I don't know, you know what I mean? In a sense, it's like us trying to push up. You know what I mean? It's not our job to do that because, we don't have the character of orders, to to ordain bishops and to catechize bishops. So there's a sense in which, we're sort of shouting as voices, seeking, we're seeking to be fed by an ecclesial environment that's healthy. And yet, I mean, I see that we have a couple minutes we've got to fill now because Timothy's dealing with something, and I don't know how he edits his videos. But maybe I'll say this because I've got you as a traditionalist who's present here. And I like that from our private conversations, and I think what I said today, I really deeply share concerns about the
Sure.
whole way up institutionally, even if it's
Sure.
not even in the Roman world. That's not my own.
Mm.
Why is it though? Is it a trauma response that trads have to to inveigh against everything? I mean, it is inveigh worthy. I talked to my wife about my frustrations, but I feel like that one rhetorical move you just made is enough to then people are gonna be like, cranks be cranking over there. So this is nothing but hermeticism at this point. Like really, I don't think I'm fraternally correcting you. I'm just asking is like it's the thing I want to say to trads. It's like don't make them see stuff that you say and now not listen to you.
Yeah, fine. I mean, I think actually, funnily enough, I've thought quite a lot about Tomberg's section in the Meditations on the danger of polemic, and I think even now I sort of read certain sentences in that book that I think are uh, unrestrained to aggressive. But I'm also trying to share in what I think is a widespread sense of scandal. Um, and you are absolutely right. In the end, the scattered sheep with no shepherd are not going to get very far. So yes, this needs to be a renewal in the hierarchy, which I have no control over. But in the meantime, we're not absolved of the obligation to look for the ways by which we can carry out or continue our own mystagogical transformation. Um, and that, I think, is really the only message of the book. Come to think of it, I just have a rather convoluted way of conveying it.
One has to circle around mysteries. But like that's the positive project, right? Like instead in I mean, because the stuff we want to that we're frustrated with we can't address directly. I wish it would almost always stay at that level. Because in the article I made the point, because the anti-institutional element, the frustrations in general, with which I share, I felt like it almost in a certain sense clipped your wings sometimes.
Sure.
But I don't want to, that's going to open us up on a new discussion. So let you just have the final word on that because I don't want to, this is your time to sort of have the response. And then you basically gave your final word already, but I want you to have the final word. And then we should probably close up because I think Timothy's thinking whatever else he has to do today.
No,
These
that's been
academics
great.
will be
Thank you.
lost talking forever.
Well,
So
look, no,
yeah.
it's not a perfect book. It's a book I remain pleased with insofar as I get emails all the time and messages from people saying that it's helped them enormously in to use a very unpleasant phrase, their faith journey, and so. But let me just reiterate. I was not impressed at all, actually, by the criticisms that the book received from many people, many of which I think were actually in bad faith. Um, and when I read your document, I thought somebody's engaged with this in a really thoughtful way, and so I just want to reiterate my gratitude to you. And what a pleasure it's been to have this conversation with you and get to know you. I should say to the listeners, Matthew sent me some really interesting papers that caused me to think about these things at a deeper level. He actually sent them to me just a couple of days before I was heading off to the Kalahari to go hunting. And so I was sort of sitting up there on cliff edges in Africa with with papers, scholastic papers stuffed into my smock.
Papers and
Um,
yeah, in one hand are tucked away and a gun in the other. I mean,
that's right. That's right. So that was great. And no, I'm really grateful for this, if I may call it a friendship,
yeah.
and I'm grateful to you, Timothy, for hosting this. Thank you.
Well, yes, it's been a real pleasure and a joy to hear both of you have this conversation. And as we always do, we end with a prayer to Saint Joseph. Saint Joseph, patron of the Universal Church. Um, our goal here was to just do what another part of retrieving the tradition of a charitable dialogue, Dialogos here. So let's just pray to Saint Joseph here. I'll just say a prayer and we'll be done. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Guardian of virgins and Holy Father Joseph, to whose faithful custody Christ Jesus, innocence itself, and Mary, Virgin of Virgins, were committed, I pray and beseech thee that through thine intercession I may be spotless in mind, pure in heart, chaste in body, to serve Jesus and Mary all the days of my life. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.